All right, welcome to the Unbroken Ground. This is season 2, episode 40. What I want to be known for. It's going to be part one of two parts, and these might be a little bit shorter, may not. Who knows? I mean, I just start talking sometimes, and when I get to where I get, yeah, that's where it ends. So thank you for listening. I'm probably coming up. We've got let's see, a little more than probably 12 weeks left in the year, so that means about 12 episodes left. And yeah, I think I might. I'm considering this being the last 12 episodes, maybe that I do. And It's been a good 2-year run. So that would put me doing 2 years. Just the other day, I surpassed 2,000 downloads. So 100 episodes for this podcast, 2,000 downloads. I'm thinking in the new year that I will, if I do anything, I'll do some more of the having somebody over or doing two people on the podcast and just talking about things rather than just me talking. So thank you guys for listening. Those who have stayed with it, those who have picked it up in the middle, those who are listening even now. As always, you can reach out on Facebook, /The Unbroken Ground, or at The Unbroken Ground at gmail.com. Yeah, so let's jump into what I want to be known for. So one of the things that I often think through, or have been thinking through, especially lately, and I think I come back to this and but more often than not. But for me, I think about a lot about like what intellectually what it means to follow Jesus, because I think it's for me as an intellectual person. I like to ask questions. I like to know things. I like to have more knowledge. I like to learn things. And so one of the things is like, what do I want if I wanted to, if I was going to be known for one thing or known in one way about how I follow Jesus or who I am as a person, what would I want to be known for? And what do I want to make sure I get right? Because there's so much in the theological world that even just among Christians and not even like the fringe people who I may or may not really think are Christian, or those who would claim Christianity, but they claim a different don't claim Jesus as God. Don't have some of the things that the majority of Christianity, and so we're not just talking. I'm not talking about other denominations necessarily, but things like Jehovah's Witnesses, who would be not proclaiming that Jesus is God, which is a very core tenement of what it means to be a Christian, in my opinion. And not just my opinion, but I feel like that is something the Bible teaches. And so, because there's so much out there, and we so much want to be right about everything, and I think I'm along those lines. I am as well. It's like, what do I need to get right? And what do I need to get right? Like, what is God talking about? So. Last week we talked about, if you listened to last week, we talked about like, what is it that God requires? What is it that God, like it's a question that God asks, and answers in the book of Micah, right? Where he's like, what is it that the Lord requires? And the Lord, walk humbly, live with mercy, for your God and justly for your God. And so what does he require? But I think even more so, it's like if you go back and you look through Scripture, and you're like, what is it that we want to get right? And I think it's just been more and more important to me to think about what is it that Jesus says get right? Because I think if you can get right what Jesus says get right, then you certainly can live from there as a foundation for anything else you do in life. And I think there is this there is a hesitation by a lot of people because they don't actually have a they feel like they don't have enough knowledge, or they haven't studied enough, or they haven't read enough. They haven't listened to the right podcast. They haven't gone to school, and they're like, I don't know if I'm getting this right. And there's grace. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about like following Jesus, is that we're not going to get everything right. Even the most trained, deeply well thought out scholars, I think they get something wrong every now and then. And if nothing else, they're sinful people, then they're going to sin. They're going to miss the mark. Even if their theology is 100% accurate, which God is so mysterious that it's hard to say that anybody's theology is 100% accurate, but we often try to live as though it is. But what do we have to get right? What if we are, what is it that God's going to wonder about us, in our hearts, in our lives, when we stand before him? And I think Jesus gives us a pretty good answer to that. And I think it's in his teachings where he's like, what are the greatest commandments? What are the greatest commandments? And of course, they reply when Jesus asks that question with a very familiar verse especially if you had grown up in the Israelite culture or the Jewish culture, because it's the Shema, which is the love of the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Now, that's the first part, right? Because there's a second part that Jesus adds on there that I'm going to talk about next week. So I'm not going to get too much into that today. But the greatest commandment, like if you're going to get one thing right, I think the greatest commandment is where you should start. It's where you should start. If you start with salvation, start with salvation, obviously. But if you're like, how do I follow God? How do I do this Jesus thing? How do I become more like God? The greatest commandment is a perfect place to start, because it is both the motivation, the reward, the what you can lean into, what you can relax into. But what does it say? It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And this is rolling into really the first two of the 10 commandments, which is, you should have no other. You should have no idols. You have to have no other God before me, right? And the danger is for us, I think, in our culture, is that we have so many distractions. We have so many things we can love in our culture, that we can get distracted by, that we often don't notice when we've, and I don't want to use the language of falling out of love, because that's very touchy-feely and really modern, I think. But I think there's this idea that, and I think you see this all throughout the Old Testament, even, and even through the New Testament, even in the letters, when John is talking, receiving the letters to the churches, the church in Laodicea, where it says that you become lukewarm, right? You're neither hot nor cold, and I just want to spit you out of my mouth. You become lukewarm. And I think that's a little bit of like what happens when we become distracted in life, when we allow other things to distract us, when we allow other things to become more important than knowing God and loving God. Then we lose a lot of the passion and desire, and that demotivates us. And as people, if we're not motivated, if we don't have something that's kind of pushing us towards something, a lot of times we just don't, we don't do that. We don't do what we should do. We need motivation. And so Jesus calls us back to, hey, if you're going to get anything right, get the greatest commandment right. And the greatest commandment is love the Lord with everything you have. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. And I think that it's important to realize that loving God is a relational term. It is not a study term. Um, and here's what I mean by that. And let me say it again because I think it's important. Loving God is a relational term and it's not a study term. What I mean by that is that you can learn, you can study, you can discover in with head knowledge many things about theology and Christian history and the Bible and how it was written and how what people have believed over the years, what people have taught over the years. You can listen to sermon after sermon after sermon after sermon. You can increase your knowledge in languages. You can increase your knowledge in theology. You can increase your knowledge. But here's the thing. Paul talks about this, right? In 1 Corinthians 13, it's the love chapter. He talks about this, and he's like, hey, if you have the knowledge, that's the greatest knowledge in the world, but if you don't have love, you have nothing. And indeed, this is something that I feel like I have seen personally and live out and be carried out in the lives of those around me. Many of you know, some of you may not. I don't know who's listening, but I went to seminary. I have a master's of divinity. I graduated with high honors. I learned all the things. But one of the things that I truly learned and truly saw and truly understood was that increasing my knowledge, increasing my learning did not necessarily correlate. So there was no relationship necessarily. There was sometimes was, but a lot of times you could learn all the facts, all the theological theories, all the theological systematic theology you want, but it doesn't penetrate into your heart and it doesn't actually help you love God. It's why that people who can have advanced theological degrees and yet be very unloving. And that's why I think that Jesus includes your heart and your head, because we can love knowledge. We can worship knowledge. We can place knowledge at a place that is an idol on our hearts. The gaining of knowledge and being, I have so much knowledge, or I'm so much smarter than you, or I think better thoughts, or I am able to, write better books, or whatever that might be, or understand things better. I know more things, and then you even get into like this weird. It's always been there, this weird spiritual thing of like the Gnostics, which is I have all the knowledge, and I have secret knowledge that only the chosen few get to have. And Paul just keeps going back to this, I think, and it just comes back. He's like, hey, time and time again, Paul's like, look, I don't have anything. I don't have special powers. I don't have, as far as what I have. Like, I don't have special knowledge. I just have, all I know is Christ crucified. And because I know Christ crucified, then I'm able to participate, to walk in the Spirit. And when you walk in the Spirit, then naturally or supernaturally things flow out of that. So Paul, I think he would say, I don't have these amazing talents or gifts because of my knowledge. Remember, he was one of the most knowledgeable persons, as knowledgeable about the Old Testament probably as anybody or anybody could be. And yet when he talks about, when he comes and he comes to the Corinthians, he says, I came to you not with fancy knowledge or fancy arguments or hidden knowledge or showing you. I came to you in weakness, and I was just like, all I know is Christ crucified. And it reminds me of the story of the blind man in John, where Jesus heals this blind guy. And he's like, you want to be saved? And he's like, I want to be healed. And so Jesus heals him, and he's been blind since he was a kid. And so the problem, of course, is, as always with Jesus, is Jesus healed this guy on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees couldn't wrap their minds around someone who would heal on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was to be observed with zero work. And because it was to be dedicated to God, there was no, and so for Jesus to heal somebody on the Sabbath, and then he told him to pick up his mat and carry it, which again is against, that's the Sabbath laws or Sabbath rules where, you're not supposed to be doing any kind of work, including carrying your mat, even if you just got healed and the guy who healed you told you to, you're not supposed to be doing that. And so the Pharisees just drag him in front of court, this religious court of the Pharisees, Sanhedrin, and they're like, hey, how did you get healed? And he's like, I don't know. I don't know. This guy came up to me and he was like, hey, do you want to see? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, and they just kept pounding him with questions because they're like, why are you carrying your mat? And he's like, because the guy who healed me said, hey, pick up your mat and walk, right? And get out of here. I can see. And they just kept and they just kept asking. They brought his parents there, and they're like, is this really the man that was born blind? Because, maybe he's a faker. Maybe he wasn't really born blind. His parents are like, hey, look, when we had him, when he was our child, he was blind. We don't know what's happened, because they were afraid of what the religious persecutions or consequences were going to be. And so they're like, hey, he's an adult. I don't know how he got healed. You're gonna have to talk to him about that. And they're like, who is that guy that healed you? And he's like, I don't know. What I do know, and I think that this is such a key statement, and I think a place that we can all come back to is, he goes, I don't know. I don't know the theological arguments that you guys are having and the truths that you guys are debating. I don't know any of those, he says. He says, I know this. I was blind, and now I see. I was blind, no hope of being healed, no hope of seeing, blind, begging, dependent upon just the kindness of strangers, stuck. I was blind, and this guy came to me and he said, do you want to see? And I said, yeah, and now I see. And I think that's a little bit like Paul. He comes to the Corinthians. He's like, look, you guys want to have fancy arguments, but I just want you to know I come to you in weakness. I come to you, and the only thing I know is Christ and Christ crucified. The only thing I know is I was lost. I was going the wrong direction, and Paul certainly was. Paul, again, was persecuting Christians, killing them for following Jesus. He's going the wrong directions. We find out in Acts that he is a witness, that he was certifying that it's a good thing that Stephen gets stoned, gets killed by the Jews, and he held the coats in a sign of approval of this is what we do with these heretics. He was going the wrong direction, obviously. He had all of this knowledge, and yet he was lost, and God came to him and saved him. And he said, I was lost, and now I'm found. And now the only thing I know is I was a sinner, and I've been saved because of Jesus, because of what Jesus has done. And so if we're going to get something right, and that's what I just these next two, this one and the next one, what do we really got to get right? What do we want to be known for? And I think the first one is just, I want to be known for a really, truly loving God with all my heart, mind, and soul. And I think one of the reasons I want, this is so important, is not just that, not just having this head knowledge, not just having this understanding of all the theological things and all the answers and all the right arguments, and knowing how to say, like the other day I was having a conversation with someone, and I was talking about how it was a miracle that something happened, and they was like, oh, that's just providence. And I was like, you're just, in my head, in my heart, I was like, you're arguing about words, and this can be important, but a lot of times we focus on the minor and we ignore the major, and we get so wrapped up, and this is especially true in American culture, I think, and especially political culture. We get so wrapped up in who's right. Excuse me, and we get so concerned about who's on what side we're on and what side we're going to take, and who's that we often move past any consideration of how do I love God in light of all of this. How do I show that I love God? How do my friends, how do my neighbors, how do my coworkers, how do they know that I love God? And then how? Is my life a reflection of that or not? That's kind of the challenge, right? Like, even in the context of when Jesus is talking about this, at least in one place, he's talking to this rich young ruler, and the rich young ruler is like, I've kept the commandments. What more must I do to inherit, what more must I do? And Jesus is like, do you love God with all you have? And do you love your neighbor as yourself? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, okay, well, go and sell all your stuff. And one of the reasons he says that is because he realizes that the man who stands before him, this rich young ruler, loves money at least as much as he loves God, if not more. And so the challenge is because it's easy to say that you love God. How do you live that out? And why is it important? Well, the reason I think it's super important is that the more you fall in love with God, the more you become more and more and more seeking to be like him. And I think that if you say that you're falling deeper in love with God, but it doesn't show in the fruits of what's going on in your life. So if you're just like, I'm falling more in love with God, but you don't have more grace, you don't have more compassion, you don't have more love for your fellow community members, then I think I'm going to question, like, what are you actually falling in love with? Oh, I'm falling in love with the God, the knowledge of his rules, because I like telling everybody where they're wrong. Well, that's not really falling in love with God. That's falling in love with some parts of what God's put together. But if you're really falling in love with God, I think that you will be more driven to be more and more like who Jesus is. And Jesus was always doing the most loving thing. And sometimes it had to do with rules, and sometimes it didn't. And he had the Spirit. I think that was one of his greatest gifts, is he had the Spirit and wisdom to discern when he should be following rules, even man-made rules, and when he shouldn't. He goes and talks to the woman at the well. That was way against the rules. A, to talk to a Samaritan. B, to talk to a woman in public who wasn't your wife, right? But then he also pays taxes to Rome. He fishes it out of a fish, but still. Like he there's a very kind of sense and wisdom of what Jesus does. And I think that, like, if we're going to truly love God with all that we have, and I don't want to bleed too far over into what I want to talk about next week, which is when we love others around us. But it is a little hand in hand. The closer you get to loving God, the more you get like God, I think that your love will grow. And again, now love is not necessarily like, oh, you just have to accept whatever somebody wants to do. Sometimes the most loving thing is to be like, hey, I love you. I'm going to give you grace. I'm going to accept you. I'm just going to love you as you are, just because I can. And you may be like, yeah, they're the most annoying person that I've ever dealt with. And yet God's like, yeah, love them. Love them like I love you. And then you're like, well, God, am I annoying to you? Pooh, man, I'm glad I'm not God. I don't have to answer that question. If you look in the Old Testament, if you read the Psalm, if you like, God got angry at the Israelite people because they were stubborn, they were stiff necked, that they refused to yield, they refused to do what he wanted them, what he asked them to do, even when he was leading them into better places. They messed it up, and so. Can you annoy God? Can you? I mean, that may be too personable of a sentence for you. May not like that, but can you raise the anger of God? Like, I don't know. Like in the Old Testament, you certainly can. Like Jesus has you kind of a different picture there, but I think that, like, I think that there's this kind of this side of like we don't realize that how much God loves us, and that He goes, man, I know the things that are rough with you. I know your rough edges, but I still love you. And then it's like, so go and do likewise. And again, it doesn't mean that you just like Jesus was the king, both metaphorically and physically and spiritually. But metaphorically, he's the king of saying like, hey, I'm not condemning you, but don't keep doing the things that you shouldn't do because they lead to destruction. I mean, it's like, it's like if you had a child who was going to reach out and touch flame, like you were like, hey, don't do that. You're going to hurt yourself. Don't do that anymore. Right? It's for your own good. I love you. And because I love you, I'm going to tell you don't do that. And we I think we major, I think, more on I'm going to tell you what not to do. I'm going to tell you where you messed up. I'm going to remind you where you fell short. And we think that there's only two ways to love. There's only two aspects to love. Like love is just like some marshmallow pink, everything's going to be okay, everything's happy, hunky-dory, happy-go-lucky. Or love is, just this obsession that we have, that we get for someone. And really there's a whole lot along the spectrum of what it means to be loving. It's loving as a parent to not carry your child everywhere. It's loving as a parent to tell your child no and teach him how to wait and be patient. It's loving to do those things because that's going to help them prepare for their future life. And so when we think about like, oh, what does it mean to love God and love others? And I got a little bit into the love others part a little bit, but we'll come back. I'll come back to loving God. When we think about, does God love me? A lot of times we think about like if it's not rainbows and pink unicorns and happy go feelings all over the place, whatever, then like we're like, wow, where is that? But it's actually love, like the Bible even says that whom God loves, He disciplines. And the reason, I think that one of the reasons He disciplines is to prepare us for our future life, now and all through eternity. And so how do we become known for loving God? And I think that's the challenge, right? Like, what can we do? There's some basic steps I'm just going to lay out, and then you're going to have to I think you need to meditate and think through, what do I need to do? But here's for me, kind of my challenge is spend time with God. One of the things I loved about reading Pray Like Monks, Live Like Fools was a reminder, was that there's this expectation that God actually wants to meet with me. And that He just wants to know me. And that I should reflect that. I should just want to meet with God. I should just want to know Him. And there's so many things in this world. I mean, I'm getting my second master's in data science. I've got full-time work. I've got a wife. I've got youth that I'm helping out at with, and then I'm trying to go to events, and I'm trying to do this and do that, and I'm trying to work out so that I can eat healthy and on and on and on. And God's like, I want to know you. Like I'm like, well, God, I don't even know if I want to know myself. Like, I don't even know if I like myself. And God's like, no, I love you. I love you, and I want to know you. And it's beautiful knowing that what Scripture says is that if you draw near to Him, guess what? God will draw near to you. God, like the picture that Jesus paints, one of my favorite pictures of the prodigal son, the story, the father is watching, and as you turn to come back, he runs. This very dignified elder statesman who you would not expect, hikes up his robe and runs to greet you because he wants to know you, and he wants you to be in his presence, and he wants that relationship. So the first question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to get into his presence? What are you going to do to know him, get to know him? And then two, all relationships take consistency. What are you going to do with consistency? Who's going to hold you accountable if you need accountability? How are you going to set a plan? What are you going to do? Because God wants to know you. And you can't love God. And this is just a fact. You can't love God with all your heart, mind, and soul if you don't know God. Because if you don't know God, if you don't actually know who He is, if you don't have a relationship, then you are actually just falling in love with your concept of what you and who you've created God to be. And a lot of times that God's in a box, and He's easy to handle, and He's easy to take care of, and He's easy to ignore. And that is not God. It's just your caricature of Him. So what are you going to do? What time, what commitment will you make to knowing God? Because it's important. Why? The greatest commandment is you need to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? Everything you are, everything you do should be a reflection of that. And yet, for the most part, we give God 1 day out of 7, or 1 hour out of 24, or maybe even just 15 minutes. And then we say, box checked. Thank you, God. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time. And we compartmentalize Him out of our lives. And so that we could go days sometimes without even remembering and acknowledging His presence. May we be, you and me, may we be people that when they see us, they go, those people love God with everything they have. And I know it because of the way that they live. And the only way for that to happen is for us to live out of a true relationship with God. We can't follow rules good enough. We can't make up enough rules. If we could, then we would have had the law, and we would have just kept that. And instead, Jesus came. He came, and through His Spirit, that we could walk by His Spirit, that we could get to know God, because He has opened up, He's torn the veil away, He's opened up that path, He's opened up that door. He said, you have the opportunity, but will you take advantage of it? In the New Testament, a lot of times it's like, God's knocking on your door. Will you open and let Him in? God's waiting to meet with you. He wants to meet with you. He loves to meet with you. Every day, every moment. So that's the challenge. What would it look like? What would it look like if you lived such a life that people were like, that is someone who truly knows and loves God with all that they have? What kind of life would that be? That's the challenge for this week, my friends. I hope that you have a good week. I hope that you're blessed. Thank you for listening. And catch me next week with part 2, which is the second greatest commandment. loving your neighbor as yourself. But yeah, thank you guys. Be blessed. Let me know if there's any way I can pray for you, if you have any further questions.